I work for a union federation, so our members are also unions. And one affiliate of ours in a meeting about 4 months ago in the UK said, you know what, one of our main problems is the migrant workers from Africa are assigned the night shift in the facilities, NHS health facilities, or even the private care. So we cannot. It's hard. There's a cost to us to assign organizers to work at night, and the labor inspectors never come at night. They come in the day, so they never see the Africans. And then the second story is in the same meeting, the president of the union in Zimbabwe said, well, I have lost half of my members to migration. So as we think about the larger picture, there are immediate consequences as far as just the workers themselves and the unions. So that sort of like pushed Uni Global Union to have a more thorough discussion or deeper discussion about care. I decided to choose the topic of bilateral labor agreements because this is the international expression of how we can manage care, and I'll put "manage" in quotes because really, it's not really management. But put this in context of the big patchwork of legal agreements that have an impact or try to govern migration. And these are the various entities, mostly United Nations agencies. The ILO has a set of binding agreements. The IOM, newly formed as a result of the Global Compact on Migration, an attempt at trying to get more countries to sign on to migration conventions. The World Health Organization is actually there because they worry about health systems and the sustainability of health systems. They often come into play not from a binding legal regulation, but through a code of ethics. Especially for healthcare workers. You have the human rights of the UN Refugee Agency because refugees move international borders. You have the ODC, which is the Office of Drugs and Crime, because there is human trafficking and smuggling. And the World Trade Organization has the General Agreement on Trade and Services, under which you have the movement of temporary persons. Right, so you can see they're all trying to address something tiny specific, or they're too big. But the general sense from any of all of these structures or agreements is that no one really wants to sign on to anything that is about migration. No one, I mean no country. It's a very controversial topic. So the IOM is now kind of playing a lead in terms of trying to get people to be more conscious about or more intentional about labor cross-border movements, especially for migrants. And they have included in their activities a focus on bilateral labor agreements as the main vehicle by which you would try to govern these flows. But it is the ILO that has the corpus or the body of conventions, binding conventions. But as I said, very low level of ratifications, especially from the receiving countries. Okay? And that's important. Now, what about their bilateral labor agreements or memorandum of understanding? They're not new. They've been there for quite some time now. And a study by Milton and Posner, which is actually interesting, is they put together a whole database. They had to collect from everywhere because these treaties are not easily accessible. So they had a whole research team to collect these bilateral labor agreements, and then they began to analyze that. Just two things here. You can see the sharp rise after the 1990s. And the first 2 decades are actually mostly the Europeans. I think this is part of their reconstruction, post-war. So that's the trend. And I'm seeing also more agreements being signed after 2019. What does it mean? What is a bilateral labor agreement? Usually covers these kinds of work. We will be familiar. Seasonal work is mostly agricultural workers, so the vineyards and stuff like that. interns, trainees, probably you've heard this in the Korean employment permit system. You would have a lot of that, mostly medium, small and medium industries, and so on, right? But what is interesting for me is that in the most recent decades, we're actually seeing not general bilateral labor agreements, but specific occupations that is related to care work. So here's examples of what I'm talking about, and you'll see most of them are in the 2020 something, the earliest in the 2000s. I think that's fascinating in and of itself, that the labor that is being demanded is specific to care. And we've been talking about shortages. So here's an expression of how to solve this shortage. So there, the Gulf Cooperation Council, that's members of the countries there, that's not surprising. We are familiar with that story. But you can see also the demand from Europe and developed countries that they want to hire foreigners to fill the labor shortages. I thought that Israel was interesting because they specified home-based care. And really, again, let's try to understand what these occupations are really about and who's doing what, because that often those definitions are not really clear in the agreements themselves. Three things to take away from this database, right? The green line, first of all, you'll see that 60% of bilateral labor agreements in the Chilton-Posner database have two things that are particularly important. One is an exchange of information between countries, and the other is the definition of responsibilities. Okay, but that's basic. That's every contract has that. But the information portion, though, is interesting because it forces both countries to be in a position to track whenever there's a problem, like violence has been committed or crime or something. Where is our worker? Please help me locate this worker. I received a complaint. Da, da, da. So in that sense, it's useful. And then the next thing, the next most common feature, where we have 40%, is actually worth looking at. And this is spend some time to think about what these two things are. One is to specify who are the authorized agents to recruit workers. Okay? And the second thing is to require that an employment contract be signed by the worker before going abroad. To me, I'm giving the conclusion already, just based on this observation, that these are the two minimum labor protection provisions inside a bilateral labor agreement where you can get two countries to agree to sign. Anything beyond this is probably pushing the limits of most likely the receiving country. So the third requirement, the third thing that is common in the sense of not popular, are anybody outside of governments being involved in the process. No NGOs, no employers, no unions. Okay, that's just not a thing for this. And that's interesting in itself because it speaks to bilateral labor agreements as actually not being social dialogue mechanisms, despite the fact that the mere presence of a contract already opens the door and signals that, yes, this is a social dialogue opportunity. And a contract is between an employer and a worker, and that is a that is a basis of social dialogue. So that's very interesting for me as someone who works in a union federation. So in other words, if just looking at everything from before 2019, managed migration is actually defined in this sense. That's the real managed migration. All the other talks and speeches, etc. Let's set that aside. This is the thing that people want to sign on. I mean, countries are willing to sign on these two things, or I'm sorry, three things, right? So what is managed migration in this sense? It's just a simple path. No, it's just a process, a way of processing workers. There's nothing more than that. You just want to be able to process these human beings to cross the border, okay? Uh, Now, what are these? I just want to get into a few details on the question of responsibilities, right? Specifying the responsibilities of each country. Well, the one who does the screening is the responsibility of the sending country. That's what it means. There must be screening. Who is skilled, who is not skilled. So Seoul City, Philippines, you tell me if those are skilled, then I will take them. But that's your job. Um, the importance of recruitment. Why is it important to specify an authorized recruitment agency? Because the second, just look at the second row, because recruitment fees have been identified as a major source of exploitation. Migrant workers enter into debt in order to pay for the cost of moving. And oftentimes they are paying 6 months, even a year worth of salary just to pay back. Once the recruiting agency becomes exclusive to the government who is receiving these workers, the recruitment fees go down immediately or sometimes removed. And then that removes all the indebtedness, the issues on indebtedness, and helps the migrant worker to be more sustainable as a job. I'm skipping. But one thing we note, and this is related to the employment contracts, is the fact that there is no consultation or that social dialogue is as a mechanism is not applied, which makes contract enforcement a lot more difficult. So there are two layers here. There's no enforcement mechanism in any of the bilateral agreements, no enforcement mechanism, therefore no arbitration, therefore no jurisprudence at all. It's just a bunch of paper without any real legal anything. Contrast that with bilateral investment treaties where there's heavy arbitration and jurisprudence at the international world. Unions are trying to figure things out. And so, they were asked by the survey, have you participated? And most of them said no. A significant number said a little bit, maybe in the early stages, but they're not in the negotiations themselves. So, and they understand that immediately the environment is already tough enough as it is. The legal restrictions are there, migrants are afraid, but then you also have the fact that the kinds of occupation, that nature of care worker occupation can be temporary informal. In fact, that's the preferred kind of migrant, the temporary informal worker, which means high transaction cost for unions to organize them. Okay. So imagine that. Last 2 minutes. So imagine that you have a difficult situation, legal constraints, and then you have, the worker themselves are afraid of unions. Unions try to set up their own agreements, but this is very rare, and run programs. But most of that is really, very tangential to organizing or to bargaining. So, in summary, hooray! In summary, the constraints to BLA as a space for social dialogue are extremely immense, right? So you have the institutional limits, very heavily the legal limits, and then you have countries, the receiving countries, wanting to undertake preferential managed migration in the most limited sense of management, right, using bilateral labor agreements. And then, of course, the lack of enforcement mechanisms, which really further weakens whatever protections these agreements are supposed to provide. What I would like to see in the next stage is actually an updated assessment with the specifically focusing on all the BLAs that identified care workers as the main occupation that the receiving countries are interested in hiring. Thank you.
Thank you. Marina Durano set the standard for all the other presenters to keep in time. So thank you very much, Marina.